I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The Times has been criticized for too many negative editorials and columns about President Trump. We invited his supporters to write to us. Hundreds did. Two of those who live in the metropolitan area explained why they continue to believe in his presidency. The actress and writer Dael Orlandersmith joins us. She examined the life and death of Michael Brown and the impact on the residents of Ferguson, Missouri for her play Until the Flood. It received a rave review from the Times' co-chief drama critic, Jesse Green. My Times colleagues discuss the key issues of the week on The Backstory, and I'll offer some final words with Coda. But first, supporters of President Trump, New York City residents Dane Davis, who works in the financial industry, Alexander Goldstein, who did interior design for the government. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate this. Gentlemen, let me ask you, when you went to vote in November of last year, the year before, did you intend to vote for Donald Trump, or were you voting against Hillary Clinton?
I would say it's a combination of both. I liked a lot of things Hillary Clinton said. I disliked more than I liked. And I thought Donald Trump brought something new. I think despite his wealth, despite his celebrity, he's an everyman. I think ordinary people respond to him in a way that they don't respond to Hillary Clinton. And when I say ordinary people, I don't mean the New York Times cliche of people sitting in flannel shirts at Marie's coffee shop in Nowhere, USA. I mean those too, but I mean people in blue states, people in red states.
People from Brooklyn Heights.
People from Brooklyn Heights. They see a genuineness in him that I think they didn't see in her, and I did as well.
Mm-hmm. Dane, what about you?
Absolutely, I would agree with him for both. It was a vote against Hillary, but it was also a vote for Mr. Trump. I was attracted to Mr. Trump in the primaries. I'm a right-wing leaning guy. But what drew me to Trump more than the man himself was the ideology behind him. And despite what some may say, I think there actually is a clear articulated ideology. It's an ideology against the prevailing ethos of this day of liberal globalization. He spoke about trade. He brought up the idea that perhaps it's not best for the United States to have open markets, that we need to pull back from some of these more extreme trade deals. He talked about the immigration issue. He talked about no more foreign wars, and most importantly, for a less interventionist Republican such as myself, someone who was attracted to Ron Paul, he talked about the end of nation building. And so for me, I support Trump throughout the primaries, support him throughout the election, and I've supported him throughout his presidency so far.
What don't you like? A number of our readers who were Trump supporters say, yes, he's embarrassing, yes, he picks unnecessary fights, yes, he tweets too much, but what are the buts with you?
In terms of what I don't like?
Yeah.
If
anything.
I would have to say he's a little too blunt. He's a little too indiscreet. He's not what we thought of or had thought of until now as presidential. I think, but on the other hand, I think that can be an advantage. That can be a positive. I think, for example, when he said at the Charlottesville tragedy, when he said there are good people on both sides, I think that ordinary people, I include myself in that, thought that he meant that there are people that believe we should preserve tradition. We shouldn't burn books. We shouldn't erase people from photographs. We shouldn't erase history. We should respect tradition even though it's flawed. And I think those people were frightened into silence. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the kind of thing that would overcome those negatives from me.
Dave, what about you?
Well, I agree with everything that he said. I would add...
You're both being too agreeable, really.
Well, we both are Trump supporters.
And great minds do think alike. No, I would also add, I think that there's a certain tendency in Mr. Trump to try to appease, I think, the business community and to try to be seen as accepted with the Upper East Side, so to speak, of Manhattan. Him coming from Queens, he's never quite fit into that crowd despite being a billionaire. So in the sense that he follows conservative orthodoxy towards the economy, that's where I start to split from Mr. Trump, constantly touting the record high stock numbers. I think that's an achievement. I think he should be proud of that. But I think that we have to focus on, and I think he should rightly focus on wages. Mm-hmm. The fact that wages are finally rising, and wages are rising for those at the poorest end of the income ladder. That's a huge achievement. I would love to see him celebrate it.
Is he a liar? I mean, there are plenty of instances where we have said in print, not that he, fudged or something like that, but he actually lied about certain things, that he claimed credit for things that he didn't do or no president has necessarily done. Does that bother you in any way?
I think he speaks from the gut, and I think people that speak from the gut and who are not filtered speak things that are not entirely accurate sometimes. I don't think he sets out to think, I'm going to lie to these people, I'm going to pull the wool over their eyes. I think he just speaks, and I think he sometimes pulls back what he says. And I think, but I wouldn't call somebody like that a liar. I mean, you know, we're dealing with, this is new territory. This is a new kind of president. So I wouldn't use the word liar. I don't think that's correct.
I think he has a tendency to engage in what you could call truthful hyperbole, in the sense that he overstates. Is
that a euphemism for
No,
lying?
that's absolutely not a euphemism. I think he overstates things, he over-exaggerates things, but through over-exaggeration or overstating things, he makes his point and it resonates with the audience and the crowd. I think Scott Adams, the Dilbert creator, has frequently brought this up about persuasion. I think Mr. Trump is very good at persuasion. He's certainly very good at commanding media attention. So I don't think that, you know, there are some areas where he may have contradicted himself or, you know, contradicted what he said in the past. But if you look at the policy and you look at when he starts to take action, it's been fairly consistent.
Why is his approval rating so low? I mean, it can't all be that the media is attacking him. That may be responsible for some of it, certainly. But if it's 39% or thereabouts in many polls, why so low?
Well, if I may start, I think that there's been a hysteria from the media. The idea that he is both incompetent and wildly so and a fascist at the same time are two irreconcilable positions, right? He can't be both Mussolini and a joke. He could either be a serious threat to the nation or he could be a total joke to the nation. Yet the media...
Why can't he be both?
Well, you can't have a fascist come and emerge in the 21st century America that's also vastly incompetent. So, but the media sends out both of these messages, and then they rotate and they shift from time to time.
But doesn't he feed some of that, certainly the joke part?
Absolutely not. I think that there's just been a constant drumbeat and a constant hysteria. And I also think, you know, I think a lot of people, they listen to the media. If you go from the New York Times to the Washington Post, to CBS, NBC, ABC, CBN, MSNBC, all these organizations are arrayed against him. Trump, it's not only what he says and his comical nature, his ideology challenges the status quo. This notion, I mean, New York Times is owned by people that believe in open borders, and Trump challenges that. Thus, I think some of the hysteria, he challenges the elite consensus, which has been dominant in this country since at least the late 1970s.
Most of your objections, I assume, have been with the editorials, the columns, but you raised a good point in your letter. You said, why don't we do this survey, this kind of appeal for people who want to support Trump? Why didn't we do it for Obama voters? Why didn't we do it for Eisenhower voters? Trump voters are not circus freaks to be dragged out or displaced or singled out.
I feel very strongly about that. I mean, on the day after the election, Ben Brantley wrote a theater review for a play by, I believe, Richard Nelson. And in the first paragraph of the review, we talked about yesterday, being election day, being an abscess on the country that needs to be drained. And this was mild for Ben Brantley. And I think he had the permission of his editors to say something as disgusting as that. And he's been going on and on since then. Holland Cotter, Anthony Tomasini, even just...
You think there's too much piling on?
Just the arts. I mean, not even talking about the politics. And, you know, liar, racist, every day in the editorials, editorial writers in the Times editorials. So I'm not surprised, I mean, with this onslaught that Dane is referring to, that the approval ratings aren't what they should be. I think that'll develop in time, but I think the New York Times has really, I think they have joined. They've become activists rather than reporters in some respects.
One of our readers, one of the Trump supporters said, "New York Times, I will always love you despite our disagreement." I hope the both of you agree with that. Dane Davis, Alexander Goldstein, thank you both for joining us. And in a moment, the playwright and actress Dael Orlandersmith. Welcome back. Joining me now, the activist, playwright, actress Dael Orlandersmith. 18-year-old Michael Brown was ready to enter college when his life ended at the hands of a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Ms. Orlandersmith created 8 characters out of the many people she interviewed in and near Ferguson, and she portrays each of them. The result, Until the Flood, now at the Rattlestick Theater. Co-chief drama critic of the New York Times, Jesse Green, wrote last week, Dael Orlandersmith does a great public service in her new play. She brings the questions, the pain, and even the unspeakable thoughts of hundreds, if not millions, to life. Until the Flood is an urgent moral inquest. Did you set it out to be an urgent moral inquest?
No, and actually, I'm not. I don't know who said activist, because I'm not. I'm just a playwright and an actor. Would it happen?
I wouldn't say just.
Well, thanks, but it's St. Louis Repertory Theater approached me about this because they're suffering from a thing they called Ferguson fatigue. Mm-hmm. By that, what I mean is that they said they were so tired of a couple of things. They were tired of Ferguson or St. Louis, which is part of Ferguson, being associated with killing, mm-hmm. but they were also aware of the racial unrest. So how do we take this and make it palpable some way and create some sort of dialogue, fuss theater? So they approached me, and I interviewed a few people, but I made it very clear. I said, these are composite figures. I'm not doing you because what's happening here does affect the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. So that's what it is. So I think I had a healthy sense of boundary in terms of doing it. So there were 3 days of just me meeting certain people, getting ideas about how the way people felt about it.
How did you meet them? How did you get people to talk about a subject that could be so painful and so sensitive?
Well, Seth Gordon, who's the associate artistic director of St. Louis Rep, met someone who's a social worker, and and also works in the community activists, you know. And so I met people like that. And one of the people I did in fact meet was Michael Brown Sr. Mm-hmm. And again, making it clear that I am not, you know, again, playing you. We don't, and also, again, just like saying, portraying how people felt about this. And even if I were to play them, no one knows specifically what happened between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown those last moments. Mm-hmm. We don't know. But that doesn't interest me. I want to get a sense of race relations, people relations, how this affected this community, how far have we come, how far have we gone back. And that's, having said that, that's big, you know.
That's big enough. 3 years ago, actually more than 3 years ago, what did you learn in this process that you didn't know before?
You know, I met some great people in Ferguson, but and I call it that part of the world, it could be 2015 or 2018, it could be 1958, it could be the city of Ferguson is divided. For instance, we're here in Midtown, right? So I live, like I told you, on the Lower East Side. That becomes a different city and a different mayor. Mm-hmm. You'll have here a different city and a different mayor. To keep the racial divide going, you had these little cities that were coming up all over the place to keep people segregated. And what they were doing was busting black men, charging them $100 fine, $300 fine to keep income coming into these little cities. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that I realized. I also realized that how painful it was for certain people to talk about race.
Black and white?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. To talk candidly about it? Or?
To talk about it, period. Mm-hmm. It's some the way certain people, not all, the way certain people lived, it was a throwback. You know, so that's what I learned. But I also learned that also there were people who wanted to get on with this and also wanted to discuss it. In other words, it's extreme. Mm-hmm. It's people who didn't want to talk, people who did want to talk.
Jesse Green in his review said that the black characters in the play are much more nuanced. Did you find them more or less willing to talk about race than whites?
Well, I thank him, but I don't think some did, some didn't. I don't know whether they're more nuanced. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily agree with that. No, yes, some were, some weren't. A lot were angry, but it was important for me overall. Mm-hmm. To make sure whatever the characters were, black, white, male, female, that we didn't have to necessarily like them, but we had to understand them. Mm-hmm. Because my job is theater maker, beginning, middle, end, story, conflict resolution, and I have to bring a love to all of them. Otherwise, they will be caricatures.
And in fact, Jesse Green said that even the worst human being among them, a racist and a homophobe, is allowed to tell his backstory, and you could either take it or leave it.
But we are formed by childhood. Mm-hmm. And also, again, when we look at, say, Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, they're also formed by childhood.
So how much do you forgive? How much of that is an excuse for bad behavior? Or, you know, don't we ever learn? Don't we get better?
I think there is cause and effect, but also I think we have to look at the fact that initially, yes, we should in fact get better. And I'm giving you a mixed message. I think certain people are so damaged they don't even realize, or if there is a realization, it's so painful to get to that place, they push it aside. I think we do. There are many of us, in fact, who do want to get better.
What is the process that you go through? You have all these people there one at a time. You interview them. Do you tape it and then distill it and synthesize it?
I was taking notes, and like I said, I sat down with all of them and said, I'm not playing you. This is just composite. And then I'm thinking, okay, what sounds the strongest? What brings it home? Because again, like I said, the boundary thing has to be there. This is still theater, still, storytelling and acting. So,
and when people walk out of the theater after seeing this, after seeing Until the Flood, what do you want them to feel?
I hope I gave them permission to feel comfortable and uncomfortable. And I hope I invoked and provoked thought, because I speak to people, not for them. I don't have the right to do that. To speak for people? No, you can't do that.
So you let them express their own voices.
Quick story. About 15, 20 years ago, I saw Brian Dennehy do Death of a Salesman. There was a Hasidic Jew in front of me, and there was a Hindu. They were sitting, at the end of the show, they got up, both of them were crying, and they said, "That is my father." That's what it's about. That play will invoke and provoke that kind of thing. When I talk about Arthur Miller, I'm talking genre, not necessarily great. I cannot do what that man does. But the fact that these two men walked out of the theater talking,
they were moved.
They were moved, but they also realized the similarities. Arthur Miller did his job.
Was there a character you particularly liked or felt particular empathy for?
The character Paul, who is a 17-year-old black boy who wants to leave Ferguson because he grew up in the Canfield apartments.
Feeling defeated, as you said.
Well, no, that's another character.
Oh, okay.
But this character is he wants to go to Berkeley to study art history, and he's carrying Romare Bearden, and he's carrying Da Vinci, and he's Elizabeth Catlett books, and he feels empowered. That word is so overused, but empowered by art history. I love him.
And where do you think he'll wind up? Will he ever go back to Ferguson? Or?
Well, the thing is, because again, you had cops who were just randomly pulling black boys over. I hope he does. I hope he doesn't get shot. His whole thing is because people were lumping us with the kids who were doing crime. He goes, I never had any kind of thing on my record. Because sometimes when people think it's just a small crime this, a small crime that, what happens within the media is that they're making it sound that everyone who comes from this background is going to resort to crime, be it petty or no, So that I don't want that being created. And it's not. When you see the piece, you see that there's an array of people.
Well, open your mind and see the piece. Dael Orlandersmith, thank you for joining us. You can see Under the Flood at the Rattlestick Theater on Waverly Place until February 18th. The backstory coming up in a moment. The federal government shutdown reopened, the arguing and horse trading continues. He said, to continue the metaphor, sort of, the dog and pony show continued in Albany as well. The governor and the mayor each jockeying for power, and meanwhile hapless commuters still try to get from point A to point B. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my Times colleagues, contributing writer Eleanor Randolph and City Hall Bureau reporter J. David Goodman. We have sort of a semicircular roundtable today. The mayor was going to meet with Donald Trump yesterday. We had a couple of guests on earlier who were Trump supporters. Those letters to the Times from them and others curated by Tom Thayer and Sue Mermelstein, hundreds came in. But did the mayor make a mistake canceling that meeting over immigration policy when the city arguably needs the president?
Well, I think in retrospect, probably not. I mean, if you saw what the meeting actually turned out to be, it was about 10 minutes or so of the president talking at a room packed with something like 100 mayors who were invited. I think not all of them went. Some of them did boycott, like the mayor of New York City. But the mayor wouldn't have had a chance to say his piece anyway, and it turned into kind of a photo op. So I think, the mayor ended up on the right side of that. He got to have his moment of standing up to Trump, so much as it was. But interestingly, as of Monday of this week, he wasn't invited to the sit down. And so he sort of said, well, that's fine, I won't go. And then he gets invited. He talked about how it was important to go there and talk about infrastructure.
And he won't go anywhere.
And then this thing comes out, and it clearly was targeted, maybe not at New York City in particular, but at mayors in general, to put out a statement like that, essentially threatening cities that have sanctuary policies. The day that you're meeting with mayors, I mean, that's not how you sort of roll out the welcome mat. So I don't think he was going to get anything more by going than he got by not going.
Eleanor, a lot of talk I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I don't think Trump has a welcome mat, you know.
A lot of talk these days about congestion pricing. The mayor seems to be inching toward supporting it in some way. Does it look like it's actually going to happen this time?
You know, it seems to me because Cuomo supports a version of it that you're going to get somewhere. Now, the tolls on on what I used to call the free bridges, the East River bridges, I don't think they're going to do that, but they're going to try to work out a way to charge more for people who, I think it's now south of 60th Street instead of 63rd or so, but you know, there are so many details that need to be worked out, and of course de Blasio still talks about this millionaire's tax that he wants to the whole idea really is to put some money into the MTA, which, I mean, if we could sort of spend this whole time talking about the MTA because de Blasio and Cuomo are just like two kids in a sandbox fighting over what should be done about the MTA. And it is so crucial that they get a sort of revenue stream that they can count on year after year.
I was in London recently, and I don't think congestion pricing there did much to improve traffic, but it is generating money for transit.
Right. I mean, even if it does nothing to alleviate the traffic problems in Lower Manhattan, at least you're sort of mining that traffic for some kind of revenue. You could look at the traffic and say we're getting some benefit out of it, even if we're not moving faster in it. And so there's an argument to be made for it, even if it doesn't improve. I'd heard some concern amongst people that really would advocate for congestion pricing that, maybe we end up in a place where we don't get a zone, but we get the surcharge on the for-hire vehicles, and the governor can claim a sort of partial success. And people are really worried that that's where this is headed, at least some people that I've spoken to. And it's easy to see something like that come out, that's the easier piece to do. And, the zone, which a lot of people would oppose, already you have elected officials in Queens and other outer boroughs.
Make a virtual zone.
Yeah, or just for people that take taxis and not people that actually drive in.
Interesting thought. Speaking of tolls on the bridges, I still wonder what happened to all those toll collectors now that we have automatic tolling. Are they still employed by the city, by the MTA, or?
On the Port Authority? Well, I don't know where they are, I mean, the MTA is something that we should be talking about all the time right now. I mean, the governor is talking about the frills, and he wants, and I like the frills. I like to go. I like going in there.
Well, station improvement is hardly a frill, I would imagine, right?
Well,
although it is compared to signals that are busted.
Well, that, and also you need elevators for people who are disabled. I mean, what I'm talking about frills is the things that tell you that the A train's coming in 5 minutes.
Oh, I actually would disagree, only because as a rider, I find that those countdown clocks help you psychologically to, it makes the experience of riding the subway a little bit better, in that if you know the train is coming in 8 minutes, you're not constantly looking for the train. The old version of riding the subway was the sort of existential crisis of not knowing whether the train was going to come or not at all.
Ever.
Now we know it's not coming for 10 minutes.
It's true, but if it's that or the signal, I would rather have the signal so I could actually get on a train and get where I was going.
Yeah, but unfortunately we don't see the signals. But you're right; it would be nice. It would make the trains come faster and more reliably, for sure. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, J. David Goodman of the Times for joining me, and my Coda in a moment. Here's a phrase you don't hear every day: we were wrong. To his credit, it comes from Kyle Smith, a critic of the latest edition of the National Review. Like many conservatives, Smith wrote, I had grave concerns about curtailing the New York City Police Department's controversial tactic of stopping and frisking potential suspects for weapons. I was inclined to defer to the police when they protested that they needed the option to stop, question, and frisk New Yorkers on a mere reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing instead of probable cause that the targeted person had committed a crime. Restricting the tactic, I thought, would cause an uptick, maybe even a spike in crime rates, Smith wrote. I and others argued that crime would rise. Instead, it fell. We were wrong. Instead, reported crime has plunged to lows not seen since the 1950s. Of course, New Yorkers were complaining back then that the city was crime-ridden. We feared the soaring rate of what was quaintly called juvenile delinquency. In the 70s and 80s, crime really skyrocketed out of control. But while the city's population has grown since, last year the number of homicides dropped below 300 for the first time on record. The number of felonies fell below 100,000. New York City's homicide rate declined to 3 per 100,000 residents. That compares to 24 in Chicago, 56 in Baltimore. Meanwhile, the number of stops and frisks shrunk. In 2011, there were nearly 690,000. Last year, according to the police, there were fewer than 10,000. When the strategy was at its peak, the Times reported that police stopped, questioned, and frisked more than 13,000 people in 1 year within 8 blocks of Brownsville, Brooklyn alone. Only 109 of the people stopped were arrested. In the more than 50,000 stops in that neighborhood over 4 years, 25 guns were recovered. Of course, we'll never know how many people weren't toting guns because they might be stopped. But as Kyle Smith wrote, quote, de Blasio was correct in saying that the city could withstand a sharp decrease in stop and frisk. And he was right to draw attention to the social cost of the practice. More than 80% of those subjected to stop and frisk since the start of the Bloomberg administration were, according to the NYPD, completely innocent. That means hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers were unjustly subjected to embarrassment or even humiliation. Smith still thinks the mayor is contemptible. Still, he gallantly admits that as de Blasio begins his second and final term, quote, he's entitled to an I told you so moment on the issue that swept him into office. Credit the mayor and Commissioner O'Neill. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.